Sometimes the cruelest thing in the world isn't the hand life deals you, it's how everyone around you tells you to fold before you've even seen your cards. Out in the Wyoming territory, a place carved by wind and unforgiving winters, there lived a man named Eldon Thorne. He'd been alone so long on his mountain that his own voice sounded like a stranger's when he dared to use it. By the time he hit 40, the folks down in Elkhorn Pass had mostly forgotten he existed. He was a ghost story they told their kids. The wild man of Iron Jaw Ridge. Eldon was a trapper. He knew the language of claw marks on a tree better than he knew the pleasantries of a Sunday morning. His cabin, built with his own two hands, was tucked 2 miles upriver, a fortress of solitude. 10 years ago, he'd buried his whole world behind that cabin. His wife, Margaret, and their unborn son, laid to rest under a simple stone marker. He'd carved her name with a dull chisel and bleeding knuckles. She died trying to bring their child into the world, and a part of Eldon had died with her. Since that day, silence had been his only companion. He'd come down to Elkhorn twice a season, a grim shadow trading perfectly cured pelts for flour, coffee, and the kind of whiskey that burned the memories away for a few hours. He spoke to almost no one, but one man still remembered the Eldon who used to smile. Harlan Brock, the man who ran the general store, had known Eldon back when Margaret's laughter filled his cabin. So one crisp autumn afternoon, as Eldon was loading his wagon, Harlan did something unexpected. He walked out onto the porch, a folded piece of newspaper in his hand. He didn't say much. He just looked Eldon in the eye, a deep, tired sadness passing between them. "Winters are long, Eldon," Harlan said, his voice raspy. "And the mountain ain't much for conversation." He pushed the clipping into Eldon's hand. It was an advertisement from a Boston matrimonial agency. "Elm and Proper Union," it read, "connecting dignified gentlemen with respectable ladies of good character." Eldon stared at the words. He didn't thank Harlan. He didn't say a word. He just folded the paper, tucked it into his coat pocket, and steered his wagon back toward the lonely silence of the ridge. For 3 weeks, that piece of paper sat on his mantelpiece, a silent accusation. He was a man turning to stone, and he knew it. Finally, one night, with the fire crackling and the wind howling like a hungry wolf, he sharpened a pencil with his skinning knife and wrote a letter. His handwriting was clumsy, the words simple and direct. He was a man of 40 years, owned his land, and sought a companion. He said nothing of Margaret. He said nothing of the grave behind his house. He sent the letter with a $30 fee, a fortune in furs, and a reference letter signed by the only man who would vouch for him, Harlan Brock. 4 agonizing weeks later, a reply came. A woman had been selected. Her name was Genevieve, 32 years old, no children, described as refined and educated, available for immediate travel. The stagecoach was due on a Wednesday. The day it arrived, the air in Elkhorn Pass was thick with a strange, buzzing anticipation. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. Harlan was sweeping his porch, pretending not to watch. The preacher's wife stood by the post office, her face a mask of judgment. Even a couple of saloon girls had paused their work to lean against a rail, whispering behind their hands. They were all waiting to see what kind of woman would answer an ad to marry the mountain ghost. The coach rumbled into the square, wheels caked in mud, horses breathing hard. The driver, a weary man with a permanent scowl, swung the door open, and the town fell silent. What stepped out wasn't a woman. It was a shape, a figure in a wrinkled travel dress, wearing boots far too fine for the mud and muck of Wyoming. She clutched a small, worn carpet bag in her hands, but it was her head that stole the air from everyone's lungs. A coarse burlap sack had been pulled down over it, tight. It was cinched at her neck with a piece of rough rope, tied in a crude, unforgiving knot. Pinned to the collar of her dress was a folded piece of white card. Written on it, in thick, dark, angry ink, were 3 words: barren, ugly, no refunds. The stagecoach driver didn't offer an explanation. He just tossed her bag into the mud beside her, climbed back onto his seat, and cracked his whip. The coach lurched forward, leaving the woman standing alone in the center of the town square, blind and trembling, a monument to some private, terrible cruelty. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone. They were all waiting to see what the mountain ghost would do. They expected him to turn his back, To ride away and leave this damaged thing to fend for itself. It's what any man would do. Then the sound of boots squelching in the mud broke the spell. Eldon Thorne stepped out from the shadow of the post office. His face was a mask of granite. His eyes narrowed, reading the scene. He didn't hurry. Each step was deliberate, measured. He walked right up to the woman, ignoring the stares, ignoring the whispers that were just starting to ripple through the crowd. He didn't flinch at the sight of the sack. He didn't recoil from the rope. He simply reached out a steady hand, unpinned the card from her chest, and read the 3 words. His expression didn't change. He folded the card once, twice, and slipped it into his pocket. The town waited. This was it. The moment of rejection. The final, public humiliation. But Eldon Thorne didn't do what they expected. He extended his arm, his hand open, palm up. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, but clear and steady enough to carry across the silent square. "Would you like to come home with me?" Beneath the burlap, the woman gave a single, sharp nod, and so they walked. Side by side, the mountain ghost and the woman with no face. They walked to his wagon as the entire town of Elkhorn Pass watched in stunned, disbelieving silence. He helped her onto the seat, untied the reins, and with a quiet click of his tongue, steered the horse back toward the shadows of Ironjaw Ridge, leaving the town and its judgment behind in a cloud of dust. The journey had just begun. The 2-hour ride back to the cabin was a masterclass in silence. Not the comfortable silence of old friends, but the heavy, brittle silence of 2 strangers bound by a bizarre and cruel transaction. The woman, Genevieve, sat ramrod straight on the wagon bench, her hands clenching and unclenching on the handle of her carpetbag. The burlap sack remained on her head, a grotesque parody of a bridal veil. Eldon didn't press her. He didn't ask questions. He'd learned from the forest that some creatures are best left alone until they feel safe enough to reveal themselves. He just drove the wagon, his eyes on the trail, the set of his jaw as rugged as the landscape around them. The sun bled out behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, and a deep cold began to creep down from the high places. When they finally reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a welcome sign against the encroaching night. He'd banked the fire before he left, planning ahead. Eldon was always planning. He tied off the horse and came around to her side of the wagon. "We're here," he said, his voice low. He helped her down, his hand briefly touching the small of her back. She was stiff, moving with the cautious, guarded energy of someone who expected a blow at any moment. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped aside, holding it for her. "You can take off your boots here. Floor's dry." She said nothing. She just did as he said, her movements precise and automatic. She stepped inside and he followed, closing the door on the cold mountain air. The cabin was 1 room, but it was clean and orderly. The fire he'd left hours ago still glowed in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light on the simple furnishings. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a single bed in the far corner, the quilt pulled taut and clean. A kettle sat on the stove, humming softly as the water inside it cooled. It was a place of solitude, not loneliness. There was a difference. Genevieve stood in the very center of the room, a statue of misery. The burlap sack was an obscene presence in the warm, quiet space. Her hands fluttered near the rope at her neck, her fingers twitching, but she made no move to undo it. It was as if she couldn't or wouldn't without permission. Eldon took off his coat and hung it on a nail by the door. He didn't look at her directly, giving her space. He spoke to the room, his tone matter of fact. "I don't know what they told you in Boston," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the small cabin. "And I don't care what's under that sack. That note, that's their shame, not yours." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If you're here, you're staying. You'll be warm and you'll be fed. You'll have your own bed, your own space. I won't ever raise my voice to you, and I will never ever raise my hand." He let that promise hang in the air, a solemn vow. "If you want to talk, you talk. If you don't owe me a single word. This is your home now, if you want it." She didn't move. Her posture didn't change. Eldon gave a slight nod, accepting her silence. He pointed a thumb toward the hearth. That chair is yours. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry. Then he did the most unexpected thing of all. He walked over to the table, sat down in the other chair, poured himself a cup of water, and just waited. He didn't stare. He didn't fidget. He gave her the gift of his patience, a commodity more precious than gold in that hard country. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she moved. Her hands rose slowly, hesitantly, to her neck. Her fingers, pale and trembling in the firelight, fumbled with the coarse knot. Once, twice, she failed. Her breath hitched in a tiny, frustrated sob. On the third try, the knot gave way. The sack came off. It dropped to the floor with a soft, dull thud. Her hair, a mix of chestnut and silver, was pinned up tightly. Her face was pale, her skin drawn thin over high cheekbones. There were no hideous scars, no grotesque deformities. There were just the faint, bruised-looking shadows under her eyes, the eyes of a woman who hadn't known a moment's peace in a very long time. She was not ugly. She was just exhausted, worn down to the bone by a cruelty he couldn't yet comprehend. Her eyes, a startling, sharp green, met his for a fraction of a second. They were like chips of forest glass, full of a fierce, guarded intelligence. Then they dropped, focusing on the fire as if it were the only safe thing in the room to look at. She walked to the chair he'd offered and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. "Genevieve," she said. Her voice was soft, but it held a core of steel. It wasn't broken. "My name is Genevieve Alcott." She took a slow, deep breath. "I am not sick. I am not crazy. And I did not want to wear that sack." She finally looked at him again, her green eyes boring into his. "They made me." Eldon didn't ask who they were. He just nodded slowly, accepting her words as truth. He knew a trapped animal when he saw one, and he knew that pressing it would only make it bolt. He would wait for her to tell him the rest of the story, if she ever chose to. After another minute of silence, she added, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll earn my keep. I'm a hard worker." "You don't need to," he said simply, "but you're welcome to." They sat like that for a long time, listening to the fire. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. The brittle tension was gone, replaced by something fragile, something new. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of a truce. That first night, she barely touched the stew he ladled into a bowl for her. She didn't cry. She just kept her carpet bag close and her gaze wary, like a doe ready to flee at the first sign of danger. True to his word, Eldon gave her the bed. He unrolled a spare bedroll for himself on the floor near the stove, a silent guardian in the dark. The next morning, she was up before him. The fire was already stoked, and the rich, dark smell of coffee filled the small cabin. He watched from his bedroll as she moved about the space, her motions efficient and quiet. She wasn't just existing, she was nesting, claiming the space in small, subtle ways. By the end of the first week, a quiet rhythm had settled over the cabin on Ironjaw Ridge. Genevieve was a whirlwind of silent activity. She had scrubbed every shelf, organized his traps by size and condition, and mended 2 of his worn wool shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches. She'd brought her own thread from Boston, a small detail that spoke volumes about her foresight. She still didn't speak much. She moved with a constant, humming tension, the ingrained fear of someone who had lived under the constant threat of criticism and punishment. She never took up too much space. She never made a loud noise. Eldon watched it all. He saw how she flinched if he moved too quickly, how she kept her back to the wall whenever possible. He didn't comment on it. He just moved slower, spoke softer, and made sure to announce his presence before entering a room. He was taming a wild thing, not with a leash, but with respect. On the 9th day, a heavy snow began to fall, a thick white blanket that muffled the world in silence. Eldon had been out checking his lines near the creek. When he returned, his shoulders heavy with snow, he found Genevieve outside the cabin, splitting kindling. She was using his small hand axe with a surprising, vicious efficiency. Her coat was far too thin for the biting cold, and her cheeks were flushed a raw, painful red. "You don't need to do that," he said. his voice gruff as he brushed the snow from his hat. She stopped, the axe held mid-swing. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was a spark of defiance in her green eyes. "I need to feel useful," she said, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "I need to feel like I'm not a burden." The unspoken words hung between them. Like I was before, Eldon didn't argue. He understood. Control over one's own labor was a form of freedom. He just gave a curt nod, went inside, and added another log to the fire he knew she'd appreciate when she finally came in from the cold. That night was different. The storm raged outside, trapping them together in their small bubble of warmth and light. After they ate their supper of rabbit stew and hard biscuits, Genevieve didn't retreat into her usual silent corner. She sat in the rocking chair by the fire, her hands busy with some mending, and she stared into the flames. Then, without any preamble, she began to speak. Her voice was low and flat, an emotionless recitation of facts. "I was married once before," she said to the fire. "For 15 years. He was a Boston merchant, a man with a big name, a big house. He said all the right things, quoted poetry, and kissed my hand in public." Eldon sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and steady. He didn't look at her. He just listened. "He said all the right things until it became clear I couldn't give him a child. Then, the right things stopped." She paused, her needle still for a moment. "He started small. He would lock the pantry if he thought I'd eaten too much. He burned the letters I wrote to my sister, told me she was a bad influence. He started telling his friends, his business partners, that I was unstable, hysterical." Eldon's hands stopped their work. He could feel the cold rage coiling in his gut. "I had miscarriages," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "2 of them. The doctor said it was just the way of things. Not my fault. But my husband, Cornelius, he said it was a judgment, a punishment for some secret sin he was sure I was hiding." The story kept coming, a torrent of poison that had been dammed up for years. Then he started with the rope. Eldon looked over at her hands. They were steady now, but he imagined them trembling. "He would tie my wrists to the bedpost at night, not tight enough to leave marks, just tight enough so I couldn't get up, couldn't leave. He said it was for my own safety, to keep my wandering moods in check." She finally looked up from her mending, her eyes meeting his across the room. They were dry, but filled with a pain so deep it was like looking into a well. "My father died last year. He was a watchmaker, a quiet man. He didn't trust Cornelius. He left his savings to me, in a private trust. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was my escape." She reached into her ever-present carpet bag and pulled something out, a silver locket. She opened it. Inside was a tiny faded photograph, a handsome man with a perfectly trimmed mustache and the dead empty eyes of a shark. Cornelius. "I took the money and I ran. I thought the matrimonial agency was my only hope, a way to get so far away he could never find me. But he did find me. He followed me to the agency. He paid them. He paid them extra to ruin me." Her voice finally cracked, just a little. "He told them to make sure no decent man would ever have me. He said if he couldn't have me, he would make sure I was an object of pity and disgust for the rest of my days." She looked straight at Eldon, the question hanging in the air, raw and terrifying. "Are you going to send me back to him?" For a moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind. Eldon stood up. He walked across the room, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. He walked past her, to the corner where the burlap sack lay discarded like a shed skin. He picked it up, and without a word he turned and threw it directly into the heart of the fire. The burlap caught instantly, turning from a symbol of shame into a bright, roaring plume of orange flame. It burned hot and fast, and in seconds it was nothing but ash. He turned back to her, his face illuminated by the firelight, his expression unreadable but resolute. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is your home. No one is ever taking you from it." And in that moment, something shifted between them. The truce had become an alliance. But they had no idea that the monster from Boston had a reach that was longer and more venomous than they could possibly imagine. The fire had consumed the sack, but it hadn't consumed the evil that sent it. That evil was on its way. The first sign that their fragile peace was about to shatter came in the form of boot prints. The spring thaw had finally begun, turning the snow to slush and the ground to mud. 2 days after the first real melt, Eldon was behind the cabin, near the woodshed, when he saw them. They weren't his prints. They weren't from anyone in Elkhorn either. The local folk wore worn-down, rounded heel boots. These prints were different. The tread was sharp, the heels square and deep. Military style. They were clean, precise. Whoever made them walked with a cold, deliberate purpose. And they had come close. Too close. They had been watching the cabin. He didn't mention it to Genevieve. He saw the way she was starting to uncoil, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. She had started humming to herself while she cooked. She'd even laughed once, a rusty, surprising sound, when one of his hunting dogs had tripped over its own paws. He wouldn't stir that fear back into her until he knew exactly what he was dealing with. He just became more vigilant. He cleaned his rifle more often. He slept a little lighter. 3 days later, the threat was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was just after dawn. A thin mist hung over the valley. Eldon was outside chopping wood when he heard the horses. Not the slow, ambling sound of a local rider, but the steady, rhythmic beat of trained animals moving with intent. He looked down the trail. A single rider emerged from the mist. Then another. By the time a third came into view, Eldon had calmly put down his axe, walked into the cabin, and re-emerged with his Winchester rifle held loosely at his side. The men pulled up just at the edge of the clearing that marked Eldon's land. The man in the lead was built like a brick courthouse, solid, square-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His coat was black, pressed, and impossibly clean for a long ride. He dismounted with an air of absolute authority, while the other two men remained on their horses, their eyes scanning the trees, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. "Morning," the man said. His voice was deep and carried no hint of warmth. "Name's Marshal Gideon Farrow, United States District Office, out of Cheyenne." Eldon didn't move. He didn't lower the rifle. "You're at the edge of my land, Marshal. State your business." Farrow didn't seem offended. He reached into his coat, his movements slow and deliberate, and unfolded a thick piece of paper. "I have a warrant for questioning. I'm looking for a woman. Goes by the name Genevieve Alcott." The name hung in the cold morning air. Eldon's grip tightened on the Winchester. "What's the charge?" "The charge," the marshal said, his eyes like chips of flint, "is theft. $10,000 stolen from her husband, Mr. Cornelius Alcott, a prominent merchant of Beacon Hill, Boston." The world seemed to tilt. This wasn't just a cruel husband's spite. This was something else entirely. This was the law. "She's not his wife anymore," Eldon said, his voice a low growl. "Not according to the Massachusetts court," the marshal replied coolly, his gaze unblinking. "Mr. Alcott claims she fled his home, stole the funds from his business account, and is now evading justice under false pretenses. He's a man of considerable influence, Mr. Thorne. He's made this a federal matter." The cabin door creaked open behind Eldon. Genevieve stepped out. She was fully dressed, her hair neatly pinned. Her face was pale, but her expression was one of cold, crystalline composure. There was no fear in her eyes, only a weary, simmering anger. She had faced down her monster before. This was just another one of his puppets. "I'm here, Marshal," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You don't need to search my home." Marshal Farrow turned his attention to her, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, assessing her. "Ma'am, are you willing to answer questions regarding the funds taken from your husband's business account?" Genevieve took a step forward, standing beside Eldon, a united front. "It wasn't his account, Marshal. It was mine. It was a private trust left to me by my father. Cornelius tried to seize it illegally. I took what was mine and I left. That is the only crime that was committed." The marshal studied her, his face an unreadable mask. "That's a serious accusation to make against a man like Mr. Alcott. Do you have any proof to support this claim?" One of the younger deputies on horseback shifted impatiently. "Marshal, we got the warrant. The papers say to bring her back now. Let the judge sort it out in Boston. Genevieve didn't even glance at him. Her eyes were locked on Pharaoh. And I say those papers are based on the lies of a wealthy, abusive man who has bought and paid for his version of the truth. But he couldn't buy this. She held up her hand. It was steady. I have proof. Every last piece of it. My father's will, the trust certificate, bank ledgers from Boston. They are all stored in a safe deposit box. In a bank. In Denver. Pharaoh raised an eyebrow. Denver? That's convenient. It was strategic, she corrected him. Far enough from Boston that Cornelius wouldn't think to look. She took another step forward, her voice ringing with conviction. Take me to Denver, Marshal. Let me open that box. If I'm lying, you can drag me back to Boston in chains. But if I am telling the truth... She let the sentence hang in the air. Pharaoh was silent for a long moment, the gears turning behind his cold eyes. He was a man caught between a powerful plaintiff and a compelling defendant. He looked from Genevieve's defiant face to Eldon's hand, white-knuckled on the stock of his rifle. This wasn't going to be a simple arrest. This was going to be a fire, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Eldon watched the marshal's face, trying to read the man. This wasn't some hot-headed local sheriff. This was a federal lawman, a man who followed orders. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, a hint of curiosity. He wasn't a man who enjoyed proving guilt. He was a man who sought the truth, no matter how messy it was. Finally, Pharaoh made his decision. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. All right, Mrs. Alcott, we'll do it your way. He turned his gaze to Eldon. I'll give you 6 weeks. The trails to Denver should be clear by then. I'll return on the 1st of June. He swung himself back onto his horse with practiced ease. I'll meet you here, and we will ride to that bank in Denver together. His voice dropped, taking on a deadly seriousness. But be warned, if you are not here when I return, if you have run, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth, and I will bring you back, and there will be no more chances. The marshal turned his horse, gave a signal to his deputies, and the 3 of them rode back down the trail, disappearing into the mist as silently as they had come. They were gone, but their threat lingered like the chill in the morning air. Genevieve turned to Eldon, her composure finally starting to crumble, her shoulders slumping slightly. I'm so tired of running, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the empty trail. Eldon placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple grounding gesture. You're not running anymore, he said, his voice a low rumble. This time, you're fighting back. He looked from her face to the trail, then back again. They had 6 weeks. 6 weeks to prepare for a journey that would either set her free or deliver her right back into the hands of the man who had tried to bury her alive. The clock was ticking. The next 6 weeks passed with the agonizing slowness of a healing wound. Every sunrise was a tick of the clock, bringing them closer to the 1st of June. The mountain, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Its familiar peaks and valleys, a constant reminder of the deadline looming over them. The spring snows melted, turning the trails into thick, impassable mud. But Genevieve was ready long before the earth was. She was a woman transformed. The quiet, fearful creature who had arrived under a burlap sack was gone, replaced by a focused, determined strategist. She spent her evenings by the fire with Eldon, not in silence, but in preparation. She laid out the entire story for him, detailing every transaction, every threat, every lie Cornelius had told. She drew maps from memory, listed names of bank managers and clerks, and rehearsed the words she would say. She was preparing for the battle of her life. Eldon, for his part, became her silent partner. He listened. He asked sharp, practical questions. He cleaned their weapons, serviced the wagon, and stockpiled provisions for the long ride to Denver. He was preparing for a different kind of battle, one he hoped they wouldn't have to fight, but one he would be ready for if it came. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Her fight was now his fight. The town of Elkhorn Pass watched them from a distance. News of the marshal's visit had spread like wildfire. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. Some saw Genevieve as a dangerous fugitive, a thief who had brought federal trouble to their quiet corner of the world. Others, like Harlan Brock, saw a woman cornered, and they worried. The town was divided, a jury passing judgment before the trial had even begun. Finally, the morning of June 1st arrived. It was a clear, dry day. The trails were firm. There were no more excuses. Just as the sun crested Iron Jaw Ridge, a lone rider appeared on the trail. It was Marshal Gideon Farrow. He came alone this time, his saddlebags bulging with official-looking forms, the silver star on his chest gleaming in the morning sun. He rode with the same stiff-backed authority, but Eldon thought he saw something different in the man's eyes today. A weariness. He didn't dismount until Eldon opened the cabin door. "She ready?" the marshal asked, his voice all business. "She's more than ready," Eldon replied. Genevieve stepped out onto the porch, her small carpet bag in her hand. She wore a simple, sturdy traveling dress. Her face was calm. She looked the marshal square in the eye and gave a single, firm nod. "Let's go, Marshal." The journey to Denver took 4 long, grueling days. The roads were little more than rutted tracks, and a freak spring storm turned the plains into a sea of mud for half a day. Through it all, Genevieve was a pillar of stoicism. She rode behind Eldon on a spare horse he'd acquired, her back straight, her gaze fixed forward. She didn't complain about the cold, the rain, or the hard ground they slept on. She was a woman on a mission, and nothing would deter her. The marshal rode beside them, mostly silent. He wasn't unkind. He shared his coffee, pointed out fresh water sources, and kept a watchful eye on their back trail. But he kept his distance, a professional observer waiting for the facts to play out. Eldon watched him closely, trying to decipher the man beneath the badge. But Farrow was a closed book. When they finally rode into Denver, the city was a jarring explosion of noise and chaos after the profound silence of the plains. People, wagons, and buildings were crammed together, a testament to the relentless push of civilization. The marshal didn't waste any time. He led them straight through the bustling streets to a grand, imposing brick building with tall columns and brass doors, the Denver National Bank. The bank manager, a portly man with a nervous twitch and an expensive suit, met them in a private room. The room smelled of old money, leather, and cigar smoke. It was a world away from the cedar and pine scent of the cabin. Genevieve was unfazed. She walked to the polished mahogany table, placed a small, ornate iron key upon its surface, and slid a folded contract across to the manager. "Safe deposit box number 734, she said, her voice steady and clear. "Under the name Genevieve Petronia Alcott." She pointed to the contract. "Petronia is my mother's name. It was signed under my maiden name, a condition of the trust, and dated 1 year before I was married." The bank manager's eyes widened slightly. He scurried off, checked the signature against his records, and returned a few minutes later with a heavy, black metal box. He placed it on the table with a solid thud and discreetly left the room, closing the heavy door behind him. The room was silent. This was the moment of truth. With trembling but determined fingers, Genevieve unlocked the box. Inside, nestled in layers of oilcloth, were meticulously folded legal documents and a small velvet pouch. She unwrapped them one by one, laying them out on the table for the marshal to see. The first document was her father's will, clearly stating his intention to leave his personal savings and investments in a sole, protected trust for his daughter. The second was the trust certificate itself, signed and notarized, listing Genevieve Petronia Alcott as the sole beneficiary, with explicit clauses preventing any husband or creditor from accessing the funds without her express written consent. The third was a bank ledger from Boston Merchants Trust. It showed the original deposit amount, the interest it had accrued over the years, and a final damning entry, a withdrawal of $10,000, signed in Genevieve's clear, elegant hand, dated 2 days before she fled Boston. The final document was a letter from the president of that Boston bank, dated 2 weeks before her escape. It was a formal reply to an inquiry from Cornelius Alcott, stating in no uncertain terms that he had no legal right to access the funds within Trust 734. It was irrefutable, a perfect, airtight case. Marshal Farrow read each document slowly, his brow never furrowing, his expression never changing. He picked up the ledger, then the will, cross-referencing dates and signatures. When he was finally finished, he folded the papers with a deliberate, almost reverent care and placed them back on the table. He looked at Genevieve, and for the first time, the cold mask of the lawman fell away, revealing the man beneath. "That's enough for me, Mrs. Alcott," he said, his voice softer now. "You didn't steal a dime. In fact, it looks like you stopped a theft from happening." A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over Genevieve. She swayed on her feet, and Eldon put a steadying hand on her arm. And in that precise moment of victory, the door to the room swung open. Another man stepped inside. He wasn't a banker. He wore a clean duster coat and a lean, hungry look. Eldon recognized him instantly. It was the younger, sharp-eyed deputy who had been with Pharaoh at the cabin, the impatient one. But he wasn't wearing a badge today. The man looked past Genevieve, past Eldon, and straight at the marshal. His voice was a low, dangerous snarl. "That proof doesn't change our orders, Pharaoh. Cornelius Alcott paid good money for her return, one way or another." The air in the room went ice cold. This wasn't about the law. It never had been. It was a private contract, a bounty. Pharaoh didn't even stand up. He simply shifted in his chair, making sure the badge on his chest caught the light from the window. "This is official U.S. Marshal business now, son. And I'm telling you, you're not taking her anywhere." The hired man took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "He paid me to do a job. I aim to do it." Eldon moved without thinking, stepping in front of Genevieve, his body a shield. The quiet trapper was gone, replaced by a man ready to kill to protect what was his. But the marshal spoke first, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "She is not a runaway. She is not a thief. And as of this moment, she is a material witness in a federal investigation into bribery and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. You come near her again, and I will personally see you hang." The hired man froze, his eyes wide. This was a twist he hadn't expected. "She made him look like a fool," he growled, trying to justify his position. "He is a fool," Pharaoh countered, "and a criminal. And you're about to be his cellmate if you don't walk out that door right now." That's when Eldon spoke, his voice a low rumble that filled the room. He looked past the hired gun, past the marshal, and directly at Genevieve. "She's not walking anywhere," Eldon said, his meaning clear and absolute. "She's going home, with her husband, the one she chose." The silence in the room was absolute. 6 full breaths. The hired man looked from the marshal's cold fury to Eldon's deadly promise. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. With a final venomous glare at Genevieve, he spat on the plush carpet, turned, and stormed out of the room. The immediate threat was gone. Pharaoh turned to Genevieve, his expression now one of weary duty. "If you wish, ma'am, I can file formal charges against your former husband. False accusation, attempted fraud, conspiracy. With this evidence, he'll see the inside of a prison." Genevieve looked at the papers, the proof of her innocence, the weapons of her revenge. She thought of the burlap sack. She thought of the rope. She thought of 15 years of quiet, soul-crushing terror. "I do," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "I want his name in ink beside mine on the same federal record. I want the entire world to know who the real criminal was." The marshal gave a grim, satisfied nod. "Consider it done." The monster of Boston had finally been caged, but the scars he'd left behind were another matter entirely. They left Denver the next morning under a bright, clear sky. The journey home was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet exhaustion and the first fragile tendrils of peace. Marshal Pharaoh rode with them for the first day, sharing his fire and his stories. No longer a lawman, but a man who had seen justice done. When he finally tipped his hat and turned his horse toward Cheyenne, he left them with a final nod of respect. Eldon didn't ask Genevieve how she felt. He didn't need to. He saw it in the way she rode. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time. He saw it in the way she looked at the mountains, not as a hiding place, but as a home. Sometime during the ride, he noticed she had opened the silver locket that hung around her neck. The tiny, hateful portrait of Cornelius was gone. In its place was just a small, clean strip of blank paper, an empty space, waiting for a new picture to be put inside. When they finally rode back into Elkhorn Pass, it was the tail end of spring. The last of the frost had vanished, and wildflowers were pushing up through the rich soil. The town was different, or maybe they were different. The news of their success in Denver had preceded them, carried by telegraph and travelers. The whispers that had followed them were gone, replaced by nods of respect and looks of quiet admiration. The change was slow, but it was real. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Genevieve now sought her out. The school teacher, a young woman named Miss Layla Court, shyly asked if Genevieve, with her Boston education, might consider helping some of the older students who were struggling with their reading and arithmetic. Harlan Brock at the general store set aside a tidy wooden box for her, filled with fresh paper, chalk, and charcoal pencils, with her name, Genevieve Thorne, burned into the lid. Life in the cabin on Iron Jaw Ridge settled into a new, deeper rhythm. It was a life built not on grand pronouncements, but on small, steady accumulations of kindness. 2 cups on the table instead of one. A second rocking chair, worn smooth by the fire. The scent of baking bread mingling with the smell of wood smoke and gun oil. Eldon cleared out the old dusty shed behind the cabin, patched the roof, and installed a small window and a stove, turning it into a study for her. It smelled of cedar shavings and new paper, a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Genevieve began to teach. 2 days a week she rode down to the small schoolhouse in town. 3 days a week she held lessons in her new study for the children who lived too far out in the foothills to make the daily ride. By July, 6 families were sending their children to her. The blacksmith's twins, 2 boys who had barely spoken a word to anyone, started reciting poetry. Eldon kept trapping, but he changed too. He started taking some of the older boys with him, the ones who had no fathers to teach them. He showed them how to read the land, how to set a snare, how to skin a beaver cleanly. He taught them patience and respect for the forest. He took less from the land than he used to, saying there was no sense in piling up money from pelts if it meant leaving the mountains stripped bare for the next generation. Their life moved forward, piece by piece, building something solid and real where there had once been only emptiness and grief. Then in late August, another letter arrived. It didn't come on the regular stagecoach. It was delivered by a special courier from Cheyenne, sealed with the official stamp of a federal probate court. It was from Boston. Genevieve's hands trembled as she opened it. Eldon stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The letter explained that in the course of the federal investigation into Cornelius Alcott's finances, another set of accounts had been discovered, accounts Cornelius had never known about. Her father, the quiet, clever watchmaker, had been a secret, shrewd investor. He had purchased property, invested in shipping stocks, and held private notes from merchant contracts, all in a portfolio managed by a separate law firm. He had hidden it all, protecting it for her. The letter contained a full accounting of the assets. The total came to over $48,000, a staggering, life-altering fortune, all of it held in her name, alone. Genevieve read the letter 3 times. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She just stood there, the papers shaking in her hand, the weight of this final gift from her father settling over her. She folded it once carefully and set it on the kitchen table. Eldon looked from the letter to her face. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked, his voice quiet. She was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the rugged, beautiful peaks of Iron Jaw Ridge. She thought about a fine house in Denver. She thought about silk dresses and a trip to San Francisco. She thought about all the things money could buy. Then she picked up a piece of chalk and a small slate, and she began to make a list. A proper schoolhouse for Elhorn, with stone walls that could hold back the winter wind and glass windows big enough to let the sun pour in. A clinic with clean linens, real medicine, and a woman doctor she would personally recruit and pay for. A town library with shelves full of books, maps, and newspapers, and bright lanterns that didn't flicker, so anyone could come and read after a long day's work. She didn't want a bigger house. She didn't want jewelry. She didn't want a new wardrobe. She wanted to build a fortress. Not for herself, but for other women. For the girls who were growing up in this hard country. She wanted them to have a place to go when the world tried to tell them they were worthless. She wanted them to grow up knowing their value wasn't measured by their ability to bear children or by the man they married. She wanted every child in Elkhorn Pass to learn to read with both eyes open and a mind that was not afraid to ask why. The woman who had been bought and paid for was about to buy her entire town a future. That winter, on the first anniversary of the day she stepped off the stagecoach, Eldon gave her a ring. It wasn't a fancy ring from a Denver jeweler. He had made it himself. He'd spent 2 months panning for river gold, painstakingly collecting enough flakes to melt down and shape into a simple, imperfect band. He'd traded 3 prime beaver pelts to a traveling merchant for a small, deep blue sapphire, the color of the mountain sky at dusk. He set the stone himself. It was a little off-center, and the band wasn't perfectly smooth. But when he slipped it on her finger, she looked at it like it was the first real, true thing anyone had ever given her. They lay side by side in bed that night. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers. Outside, a gentle snow was falling, pressing against the window pane, muffling the world in a blanket of profound peace. No words were needed. Their breathing fell into an easy, unforced rhythm, 2 separate heartbeats that had learned to beat as one. The wind moved through the pine trees, but it no longer sounded like a hungry, searching thing. It sounded like a lullaby. Inside the cabin, Genevieve slept, her hand resting on Eldon's chest, her new ring catching the faint, rosy light from the dying fire. The woman who had arrived in a sack, labeled and discarded, a creature defined by 3 cruel words, barren, ugly, no refunds, had refused to be defined. She had taken the broken pieces of her life and built something stronger than stone. She had become a wife, a teacher, a protector, a builder. She had become Genevieve Thorne, and she, and the future she was building for so many others, wasn't going anywhere. If you believe that courage is the ultimate act of rebellion, and that everyone deserves a second chance to write their own story, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let us know in the comments below. What do you think was the most important step Genevieve took to reclaim her life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching.